interviewing skills and approaches to interviewing. There are different types of interviews that you can conduct. I'd like to say this is not complete. In fact, we're not going to cover, say, the walkthrough that we just saw. But you could, for instance, have a structured interview. In a structured interview, questions are prepared in advance. And I want you to think when this is useful, when this might be less useful. In this case, interviewees are asked the same questions. So if you have a structured interview, you might see many different people, and you might ask the same questions. I would say this is, say, useful if you're in an organization with many similar entities. Say you are looking at your 200 different branches, call them supermarkets, call them retail outlets, call them points of sales, which are pretty similar. They all have their 5 to 10 staff. They all have a very similar look and feel. They all are in prime locations or whatever, and you all kind of want to know the same information from each and every one of them. So you can ask them the same questions. What is good about structured interviews is that, quite frankly, if you're asking the same questions all the time, it can be performed by a junior or more junior internal audit staff, since it requires less judgment, less experience. It's rather the junior audit staff would ask those questions and try to document the responses. And so you could do this on a much larger scale. And if you have a structured interview, it helps you cover all important points. In fact, what I'd like to say is that for pretty much any single interview, I think you should, at least in advance, try to note all the important things that you absolutely need to cover, So it's kind of a mix of approaches usually, but I think it's always important to, note a few important things to cover. In any single interview you do. You go into an interview not just to talk to someone, but really to get a certain amount of information. And so if it is planned, if you understand which information you want, before you do the interview, if you actually have an understanding of which kind of information you want before the interview, then it can be very helpful. But it doesn't focus on any new information. It doesn't, uncover, if you purely use this approach, you only list your things, you just have your junior auditor, going through the list. If someone tells you about something that you had not heard from elsewhere, and you don't ask follow-up questions, if you don't ask follow-up questions, then frankly, you're not going to discover new things here. You can have kind of a behavioral interview. I'd also like to say that many of these techniques can be used for interviewing new staff, for actually hiring people within the engagement team. So a behavioral interview, asks about someone's past behavior to try to predict future job performance. So this is how they acted in the past. So, when you were in this situation in this company that you worked for, how did you do this? Or, directly in an internal audit. So how did you perform this, once a year process, say the annual reporting, last year? And it will tell me roughly how they will perform it this year. Maybe they've learned a few things, huh? It asks the interviewee how they handled a specific situation in the past. And of course, it can be used to understand kind of their competence. Not that you usually put that in an audit report, but however, it might also not fully cover all the different points that you'd like to learn about something if you're only going kind of through past. Huh? You could use kind of a situational interview. And I have to say this is much more for job interviews than is for audit interviews. But in this case, applicants are asked about how they would act in certain hypothetical situations. In fact, this can be useful, for instance, for planning for something. So, when the new software system will be in place, what is your plan to do this? Or when we will actually, start the integration of a new entity, which was going to be merged into the group, how will you act when this happens? And this can also kind of plan for the future and might help, for instance, identify controls that will be lacking in the future. It can be used to evaluate critical thinking and competence, but is kind of hypothetical and doesn't investigate any past performance. I can tell you how I've used it in the past. This, for instance, in the banking context, where new regulation was coming, very, very significant new banking regulation, which could have even put in doubt the profitability of part of the banking activity. And so for that particular person's bread and butter, the money that they were making in that certain way in the department might have been strongly affected by new regulation. And so my questions were really future focused, was how will you act? What will you do? How have you prepared? What have you actually done? And this is maybe one of my only audit recommendations, which was not on which was fully on a risk in the future, not for the present, is we are not currently far enough in our process of preparation for the new regulation, because quite frankly, at this point, we should be much further. That's a pretty rare kind of audit recommendation, but you can see how a situational interview can help you get there. Let's see some effective interviewing skills. These can include trying to establish kind of a relaxed and open atmosphere. Is this for fraud interrogations? No. But for pretty much every interview you're going to perform as an internal auditor, not in the fraud context, you try to establish a relaxed and open atmosphere. Often if you've had your kickoff, people at least know you, have seen you, or at least heard the sound of your voice before, so it's more relaxed, right? You try to observe nonverbal behaviors, okay, you could identify red flags. Frankly, I'm not very, naturally good at this. I don't think I'm naturally good at observing nonverbal behaviors. Apparently, this is more the, CIA, but I'm talking about, Central Intelligence Agency, not our other CIA's book of methods, identifying nonverbal behaviors. But indeed, this is something that skillful communicators can do. Actively listen. Indeed, what is an excellent way of performing an interview? It's not speaking. An excellent way of performing an interview is not trying to interject with your question. If you want to get someone to say more about a subject, maybe you just leave them a second for an awkward silence. Make it 10 seconds, it gets really awkward. Make it 20 seconds, it gets really, really awkward. Then they feel they have to bring up more information about something, right? Or taking notes. That's an effective method for interviewing. Yeah? Open and closed interview questions. So open questions, request descriptions, narratives, different opinions about a process. I think if you see an example, you know what it is. So please describe how you created the report. And in this case, it cannot be yes or no. It cannot be 55 or the answer to the universe is 24. It has to be, usually a description. How did you do this? No. No, you didn't do this? Well, no, it has to be more descriptive. You expect more of an answer. If you are with native speakers in your language, this is a lot easier, of course. I had an interview a couple of weeks ago with someone who barely spoke my language, and I barely spoke her language. And so it was indeed a lot of closed questions that she could understand kind of our questions and answer yes or no. We kind of managed in that way. In closed question, ask for very clear answers. 24, yes, no. Were all reports submitted before the deadline? Yes, but. So it's a very clear answer.